Assalamu alaikum and welcome to this week's edition of Bookbytes. We're at the end of season 8. This is our last for this particular season before the Ramadan session. And I'm very excited because we've got a social document, an ethnographical study that I think viewers will find very interesting. In the Shadow of the Springs, I saw by Dr. Barbara Adair is a recent publication that looks at the stories of people living in the Art Deco buildings in Springs here in Gauteng. And it says it's an exploration of stories of people who live in these buildings. It is the imagined lives of those who live in a space which is not theirs historically, but one which they have reclaimed. This work, in times of doom and complaint, creates a new narrative, one of revival, vigor, and celebration. To give you a bit about Barbara Adair, who's a known local novelist and writer who has won and been shortlisted for various awards like the Sunday Times Fiction Award, the Africa Regional Commonwealth Prize, and her writing has, particularly her travel writing, has been widely published in literary magazines and anthologies. Her novels published to wide acclaim. She's currently working with the Wits Writing Center at the University of the Witwatersrand, and she received her PhD in creative writing from the University of Pretoria. Barbara, it's wonderful to have you on the show. Welcome to Book Bites.
Thank you so very, very much. Thank you for having me here. And salam alaikum. Nice to be here.
Wa alaikum salam. Peace to you as well. What a fascinating publication. Congratulations on, this accomplishment. It must have been quite an experience. Let's chat about your writing process. Tell us about your motivation. Where did this begin? Where did this all begin?
Well, it's interesting, Shafinaaz, in the sense of that the very first time I went to Springs was with a friend of mine, and he said, "Wow, did you know that there are a lot of Art Deco buildings in Springs?" I said, "No." He said, "Apparently there are more Art Deco buildings in Springs than there are in Miami. So Art Deco in a small space." So I said, "Oh, fine, fabulous. Let's go and have a look," which is exactly what we did. And we walked around and we looked at it and I thought, wow, here's a novel, because there were people and beautiful buildings, and it was just stunning. And then I asked two students who I work with at the Wits Writing Center to come with me, Shreddy and Nelly. And we went to Springs, I don't know how many times. It could have been 10, 12, I don't know, whatever. And we fell in love with drug dealers, and we bought fake designer clothes, and we ate in the local eateries, and we chatted to people, and we went into the buildings, and we just had the most fabulous time. We just hung out, and we were the most incongruous threesome: an old white woman, a young black woman, and a young Asian man. And so people just let us come through and walk through and chat to them, and they were so open. And so that's how the evolution of the novel came about.
Well, what a fantastic process to hear about, because I think just being on the ground and being able to put together the information, to capture the stories, is captivating in its own right. You spoke about, Springs. I didn't know this until your book was in my hands. I didn't know that Springs was known for having so many Art Deco buildings, and we all hear globally about, Miami being a great space. And then I thought, back in the day, I mean, I was an architecture student once, and I remember having to walk around Johannesburg. Johannesburg is known for its Art Deco buildings. So I'm so glad that you have this book, In the Shadow of the Springs, I saw. Let's go beyond the buildings. Okay, I mean, we're talking about Art Deco for some of our listeners. The Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building in America, the buildings of Miami. But we've got those examples in Johannesburg, Anstey's, Chrysler House, and some of those. Springs, the least expected of the lot. Talk to us about these buildings and the people that inhabit them.
I mean, it's very interesting because Springs used to be a big mining town, gold mining, and most of the people that lived there were immigrants. They'd come from Europe, they'd come from Eastern Europe, they were escaping the Holocaust, they came to a better life to work on the mines, or to work with the mines, let's say, in Johannesburg, and many of them moved to Springs. Then the mines closed down, And the white, let's call them European immigrants, started to move out. And so what has happened is that other immigrants have moved in, and these are mainly immigrants from Asia and from Africa. So you have Congolese, you have Nigerian, you have Bangladeshi people, you have a whole myriad, but it is still an immigrant community. And for me, the Art Deco is an immigrant architectural design. People brought it from Europe, and they brought it here because they wanted to make places that reminded them of home. And when they came here, Art Deco was the rage in Europe at that particular time. So that's what they built. And for me, the buildings have now become repositories of memory. They tell stories in themselves, as do the people who live in them tell those stories.
I take special significance from what you just said. I think this creating home, creating a sense of home as an immigrant, and South Africa is a country of immigrants, is something so special when we look back, because this is going back a century, and now being able to reclaim those spaces by a whole new generation of immigrants, and that being a repository not just of memory but new stories that you've captured here. I think that's so beautifully put. You in various of these, I like the style in which this is compiled, this publication. But you say, smell the flowers while you can. And that comes across often in the visual part of the narrative. Talk to us about that. Smell the flowers while you can.
That is actually a quote that comes from a guy. He was an AIDS activist in New York in the 1980s. David Wojnarowicz. I can't really pronounce his name so well, and he writes. It comes from a book of his, and he was an AIDS activist, and he wrote about that phrase comes because he was dying, as were people around him, and how I'm using it. It's actually crossed out. So I use the phrase and I cross it out. It's like we're dying, Springs is dying, but actually it's growing again. So smell the flowers while you can, but it's not going to die because you can smell them again and again and again. We're just crossing out, and then new flowers that are now arising. And so for me, that was why the phrase was used. But then I don't know if you also know in some of the letters, because the book is made up of stories and letters, in some of the letters there's always a ballet motif. And the ballet motif is a similar one to that, in the sense of that if you think about ballet, the ballet movement is always the same. But yet, depending upon the dancer, the choreographer, so the movement changes. And so what I'm trying to say is that it's all there, it's all the same, but yet it changes depending upon who's there, who's living there, who's appropriating or reappropriating the buildings for what they want to do and how they want to live. So that's really how it came about.
You talk and you reference, I love the symbolism, but you also reference this link between the Art Deco style and ballet as a movement. And, we often talk in different, spaces, whether it's poetry, whether it's literature, the theater of spaces and how the body moves through those spaces to give them meaning, to give those spaces or to glean meaning of those spaces. And in these Art Deco buildings that are kind of sort of there, and the body and the space and the stories that move through them makes this book rather poetic. You talk about your emails, the stories that you've written, the photographs I'm paging through while we're chatting, and the symbolic references that are made through this make this an incredibly sort of visual, but also a very experiential book, because you allow your reader to walk through the streets of Springs. Talk to us about some of the characters that you experienced as you researched for this book.
Well, the characters, all of the stories are about people that we met. But they're not written in the way of like, hi, what's your name? Oh, I'm writing down your date of birth. I'm writing down your name. When did you come to this country? Oh, okay. What do you do? Oh, okay. They're not written in that kind of a way. I call
Okay.
the style of writing that the book contains. I call it ethnographic fiction, and for me, ethnographic fiction is it's not empirical. It's not, as I say, date of birth, etc. But it's talking to a person and saying, "Hi, how are you?" Looking at them, looking at their clothes, looking at what they talk, just listening to what they're talking about, and then going away and crafting a story and in crafting a story about my perceptions of that particular person. And the reason why I did this was, number one, because I think people create themselves, so people will write stories about themselves, and so I wrote stories about them as well. They perceive themselves in a certain way, and I perceive people in a certain way. And so, yeah, that's what I think. It makes it more visceral. And as you say, you're walking through the streets, you're able to actually understand and meet that particular person. Yeah, that's how I went about it. And Dennis, in one of the stories, is a hijacker of a building and a drug dealer. The one woman who comes from Nigeria, who talks about living in one of the buildings, Manitoba House, she works in the Springs Hotel as a sex worker. They're little kids who don't know their fathers, the fathers could be anyone, Nigerian, this and that, but the one little kid had some money, and he said, "I'm going to show it to my dad," and it was a Nigerian, a note from Nigeria. So they're myriad people who roam through the streets of Springs and who roam through the streets of this book. So that's how I went about it. So those are the stories, and then the letters, because I thought actually the letters, it's not me, but it's the author who's writing about their particular perceptions of Springs, how they perceive as a South African, writing to an outsider, writing to explain and just describe the beauty of it, and clearly the ugliness, but the beauty as well. I can
And
read you
you
some.
get a sense,
Yeah.
yes, yes, absolutely. You get a sense that there's a sense of survival. There's survival mode, but there's beauty, and there's sort of a creation of meaning and beauty out of their stories. I'd absolutely love to hear a piece, so you can introduce us to some of the actual stories.
Well, I mean, I'll take a piece. The first piece. I'm not going to take the whole. I'm not going to read through the whole letter because clearly it's long. But I'll just read a little bit. A little bit. Here. Yesterday, it was in the evening, and the night was warm. I watched two people, an older man and a young boy. The older man looked like a drug dealer. Am I being presumptuous here? A stereotype. There are a lot of drug dealers in this street. He wore dark glasses and a headband tied across his forehead. On each finger of both hands, he wore a ring. I'm sure that I saw the winking of diamonds in those rings. And the young boy, well, he was just a boy. The man was teaching the boy to ride a bicycle. He held the boy around his waist so that he remained upright and did not fall onto the road. It was elegant and lithe. For a long time I watched them move in the moonlight, slowly. The adage is a slow movement, performed with fluidity and grace. The movement creates the feeling of ease. The boy and the man performed the adage. I felt happy, and I'm happy that I have this memory. Where are you, and what are you doing? So that's an example of one of the letters, in which the ballet motif is there, but also the ugliness, but also the beauty of a man teaching a boy to ride a bicycle. Simple and elegant.
And so graceful in the way that it's presented, because, like I said, your narratives bring a certain vision. You can actually experience this movement through the space, the experience of the occupants. And then also this interchange between the emails, the voice of the email, seeing the visions, and then the way in which you present people in a multidimensional way through the stories.
And also, and what I've also tried to do is create conversations between people, two people, whoever they are. They could be different people, they could be the same ones, but the conversations also explore those dynamics, the dynamics of beauty and ugliness, but the dynamics of what is this town, what has it become, and where is it going? And also there's the dichotomies that are explored there. I mean, I can give you just a small extract in relation to that, if it's appropriate.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you.
You once told me that when something changes, there is a change in texture, in texturalness. Change always results in a change in space. The change may be one in which the space becomes more fluid, ice melts and becomes water. There is a smooth movement from one space form to another, from one textural form to another. Sometimes this is best illustrated by something that becomes rotten. Change may be compared to the change in a cat. Once it dies and is left on a hot pavement, it will putrefy and decay and spread its guts out. There is a texture to a rotting body. There is a texture to the living body. And of course, the space of the pavement also changes. Its texturalness is softened. Rotting bodies makes asphalt softer. In change, there is always a change of nature, and so purpose. Space changes by a deliberate movement, a walking slowly towards, a walking slowly away.
There's a raw realness about writing in this level and in this nature, and trying to get into the minds and the experiences of the people on the ground. What have you taken this book back to the street, and what have people responded related to this sort of a book being written? I mean, it does take a stretch of imagination to say we can be condensed into a story, or this has some sort of traction as a book.
I'm not quite sure what you mean there, Shafinaaz.
I think when you're doing research, you kind of have, you build a network, you build a relationship with the people that you've spoken to. Would you
Yes.
consider, or have you considered, taking the book back down there and saying, look, we've done this, we've put stories together in the book, and we've commemorated Springs in this way?
I would love to do that. I would
Right.
really, really love to do that. And in fact, someone said, why don't you have like a book event on the streets of Springs? And I thought
Absolutely.
actually that would be the most fabulous thing, just to show people that their lives are not nothing.
We're
Their
not
lives are
today.
something
Yes.
which can be celebrated, and we can
Yes.
celebrate it with them. I mean, whether or not all those people will still be there, I'm not sure, but nonetheless, one can search out different people in the different buildings because they all are captured to a certain degree. I mean, a perfect example of this was the one day that we went was in a school holiday, and school holidays, there are many kids around. So we took pictures of a lot of the kids, and they told their stories. And they kept on saying, "You must come back. You must show us our pictures. You must put our pictures up somewhere." And I thought, what a wonderful thing! We can have pictures of kids, and the kids can be running around, and yeah. So I think it would be wonderful to
I
do
think it would
such a
be
thing.
fantastic. I think it would be fantastic, especially as you say, for the kids, because something that you think is sort of a far-fetched possibility, actually to be held in their arms and in their hands would be quite something. And I think, while creating meaning in our lives, it's something to be witnessed, to be remembered. Um, you know, there's also
Well,
this thing about social documentation and understanding that it's not just the fancy places that get remembered, the so-called fancy places. That
and the
every
social.
aspect of social life can be documented in a beautiful way and commemorated.
Well, Absolutely. And it's not just the fancy people who are written about, it's also you and me and the people walking on the street. There's
Yes.
one story about, which is a conversation about two fancy people who did come from Springs, and that was James Phillip and Nadine Gordimer.
Right.
So the one story is about them because they both grew up in Springs. And it's kind of also a commemoration of them, but in a different kind of context, within the context of what Springs is now, and looking back. And they clearly, it's fictional. They're looking back at it. But I like that there's a commemoration of the ordinary. Put it that way.
And this is quite a celebration of that. I was looking at, you've got a way of walking into Razia's Halal Foods. This is Nazim's shop, and
Yes.
then your emails to B from A. Yeah, I remember the conversation between the famous people, and it's not just the nostalgia, but being able to capture these stories, the stories of the children, the dreams that they're holding, the wonder about the future, the ordinary, and the extraordinary in that. That is so, and I think through this also, I would say an encouragement to communities, to families, to actually document their stories, their family stories, their town stories, their city stories, because there's just so much out there that we need to capture as a
And
collection of history.
well, exactly, and but also for them to capture them creatively, to not say, oh, I'm just so and so, and I'm so and so, and I work in a shop or whatever, but to capture them in a dynamic, creative, beautiful, where they can fantasize about themselves as well
Um,
as just what they are. And that's what I think the kids did, which was so nice. They would tell us these stories about this and that and this and that and this and that, and you could just hear their minds working in that they were imagining who they were and what they were doing. And it was exhilarating actually.
I think having children as subjects is just a reminder about the wonder with which they see the world, and a reminder of how uninhibited they are, the perfect sort of space to begin your stories through the imagination of a child or a group of children in this case. I really, really do hope that you get the opportunity to go to Springs and to have your dynamic launch on the streets or in one of the Art Deco buildings.
I think it would be fantastic. I think, and to have all those kids maybe singing, dancing, whatever. I don't know. It could be really fun. I mean, there's also a poignancy with the children because also they were all running around. It was holidays. They were running around. Their parents weren't around, and coming from a middle class background, when a little kid tells you, "Oh, this is my home," and he's 6 years old, and he picks up a key and he leans up and tries to open the door, but he's a little bit short, so he has to tiptoe and open the door, and then he shows you his home. Then he locks it carefully, and then he runs off down the street to play with somebody else or go somewhere else. I wasn't sure where he was going. And you just think, wow, coming from a middle class background, 6-year-olds don't do that. And yet, this
Right.
is what he did. And he told us the story about his dad, who he'd never met, which may or may not have been the Nigerian. But he had decorated his home with just pictures of what he perceived Nigeria to look like. I don't even think it was Nigeria, but that doesn't matter. So there
And
was
so
a
in many
poignancy
ways,
as
you
well.
have, yes, yes. In many ways, you have a 6-year-old who's already creating his own story and trying to find significance in that, in creating his identity. I think that's fantastic to have been captured as well. It would be great to see, how that develops for him as well.
Well, exactly.
So
And so
obviously, what
I
you have
feel
here
that
is a
I've captured.
moving story.
I beg your pardon.
I feel obviously what you have here is quite a moving document. It's quite a dynamic document.
Well, thank you. And I mean, for me, it was an exciting process, and I think it's exciting that it's out there, and I think that it's got the pictures, as you say, and it's got all these different elements to it. So it's it's got a little bit for everyone, if you want to call it that. Just someone who wants to look at pictures, they look at pictures. Someone who wants to
Right.
just read a little bit, they can read a little bit. Someone who wants to read a long story, that's what they can do. So yeah, I think it's. I mean, I'm so happy that it's out there. Mm.
And I think in typical Art Deco style, it's bold and courageous to, to formulate a publication, and successfully so. That's been formulated in the way that you have the different styles, the interchange between the visual and the written element, poetry, the sort of the story, and the emails, the conversation, the ongoing email conversation that continues as well. So, Barbara, thank you so much for this publication, for sharing it with us, and for the conversation. We wish you everything of the best on your onward journey.
Thank you so very, very much. And I'm so happy that I was on your show. And I really, really appreciated your questions. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, absolutely. We wish you all the best, like I said, with the continuing launches. And I hope to hear, at least offline, what happens when you take this book back to the Springs community. All the
Well,
best.
exactly. We'll have to meet and we'll go and we can have lunch at Nazim's place. And then we can chat about it. Why not? Mm.
Fantastic. Thanks once
Okay.
again. And so
Perfect.
there
Thank you.
you have it. There you have it. We spoke to Dr. Barbara Adair about In the Shadow of the Springs I Saw, her ethnographic fiction of the art people living in the Art Deco buildings in Springs here in Gauteng. And that's it from this weekend, and everything of the best until we meet in the Ramadan season next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.